Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. We've got an incredible guest today, and I'm really excited for the insights and ideas they'll be sharing. There are so many practical learnings from the conversation that will make a difference to you, your team, or organization. If your organization is interested in a workshop on this topic of the podcast, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. If you want to support our podcast, and you'll find a link to our Patreon in the podcast description. Thanks in advance for listening and your support. Now, let's take a different path to success. Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Our topic for this episode is creating a work culture everyone wants. Joining me today to discuss her book, Why We're Here, is Jennifer Moss. Jennifer Moss specializes in future focus leadership development, expertly balancing employee well-being with performance. As an award-winning writer and internationally acclaimed keynote speaker, she specializes in transforming workplace culture using data-driven leadership strategies. Her previous book, The Burnout Epidemic, tackled employee burnout and was among Thinker's 50 10 best new management books for 2022. Jennifer, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, William. I think this is going to be a really, really good conversation. I can't wait.
I can't wait either. And let me start with high praise for this book. Companies at the moment are focused on cost savings. As you mentioned in the book, we're living in liquid times when things are changing and moving so quickly. And this book, what I like about it, makes the argument that workplace well-being makes commercial sense. It's evidence-based, it's research-based, and this book has loads of examples, and you've outlined the 8 areas where organizations can transform a workplace, as you mentioned in the book, way down with ennui to a healthy and high-performing one. We were just talking before this podcast that I said I could actually have done an episode on purpose alone. You know, there's so much in this. So let's begin. So the 8 areas, like why 8 areas and why are they all so important?
I love that you asked that because as I was writing this book, my editor from HBR says that I am a discovery writer. So that's
Yeah.
that person that might have a outline, but then they take off based on gut or they feel something and they need to pursue it. But this one I think was all discovery because it came after this huge cataclysmic moment, which
Yeah.
was the pandemic. And then we had polycrisis, which is just a cluster of crises now making each one worse. So we haven't really gotten out of the pandemic. And, everything just seemed to be happening all at once. And so for me, it was to really look at what we'd lost. What have we lost in the last 5 years? And a lot of it was just kindness. It was these sort of familiar ways of behaving as human beings, and that had atrophied, that muscle of community, of connecting with people, of hopefulness, of a sense of purpose and meaning in what we do. And these big business challenges that have come to confront us in a way that's completely novel that we have no framework for. And so as I was going through this, I realized we have to have a bit of novel and familiar. And it's these 8 leadership traits that I feel is the new framework in this uncertain, liquid time
Yeah.
that we're in, this era of deep uncertainty in the workplace. And we needed to have a bit of both, that emotional intelligence piece that has been missing, the human connection piece that makes us, want to see a future where we're all in it together. And then I think also recognizing that there's, that we need to stop jamming the toothpaste back in the tube and come up with sort of radical acceptance of this next future of work.
In the introduction of the book, you said there's oversimplified tactics being deployed. It kind of like copy and paste or not fully thinking things through.
Mhm.
Now, if I'm honest, and I'm going to be devil's advocate here, if I saw courage and purpose and hope as title for these chapters, I'm as a business leader, I'm just going to go, oh, there's no evidence here or research. That's the exact opposite to what is actually written in the chapters. And I want to go deep dive into that because you also said in the introduction, someone somewhere has made a call to prioritize growth and productivity over connection. And we're seeing the downstream impact of that. So these 8 areas, then, like, what is it that people are missing?
We've been measuring the impact of, and there's now causal, a relationship that's causal between well-being and business outcomes.
Mm.
Jan Emmanuel Deneuve has done a really good job out of the Oxford Wellbeing Institute, and we see that with Adam Grant. I mean, we're looking at, if we have more well, healthy, happy people at work, they're higher performing, and the business outcomes are there to prove it. But it's really difficult for people to wrap their mind around that, because we're now in this state where we're constantly having to provide measure. And that measure that we're looking at seems to be very short-sighted. It's, and we measure productivity by hours. So the more hours we work, the more output. It looks like we're delivering, not just as a company, but as a country. And so this 100-year-old way of marking success it should be obsolete, but it continues to be the way that we measure health in our organizations. And I mean business health and growth and health from a purely capitalist standpoint. So I think that it's just easy to fall back on that. But what we've come to realize is that unless we really start stepping back, we're going to continue to be in this state of high disengagement. Gallup is calling it the great detachment, this era of the great detachment. And it's because people are just disconnected from their identity with work. And that's continuing to happen. All of the ways that we're, bringing in these new policies, or leaders are sort of loud firing, you see loud layoffs, you see things like return to office mandates and policy that's going against the data to say this isn't working. We're still seeing that happen because it demonstrates to shareholders that there's action that's being taken. But it's a short-sighted narrative. And I think it's going to create a lot of obsolescence for companies that don't figure this out quick.
So let's offer our listeners here, and as you do with the readers, some hope. So there are some organizations that are doing things right. So, for example, Google with OKRs. You might elaborate on what OKRs are, and why is it that it works for Google, their approach?
When you look, I mean, OKRs can be described in different ways, but it's essentially, your organizational goals, the way that you look at hitting certain expectations, and every single organization has that, but individuals have that as well. And Google, when they look at kind of thinking about goals, they co-create them. They are just challenging enough that it feels good when you achieve them, but not, so hard that people can't actually achieve their sort of a decision around what is successful for them. And I love that, what they do in Google, for example, when it comes to reaching and attaining goals, is that it's fluid. So you can be malleable in how you're actually getting to those goals. And this is the big thing about hope. And, I write hope is the first chapter, which is interesting because Gallup just came up with this data that found that the most important leadership skill for today, and this was just maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago, it's hope. By the most, difference between hope and trust, hope was way far above the rest of the leadership skills and traits that leaders need today. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are in this epidemic of hopefulness, or hopelessness, I should say. We're in an epidemic of hopelessness, and especially in our young people. So we're trying to galvanize young people. We're trying to get them excited about the future of work. But how can they do that if societally they're feeling like they don't feel a sense of themselves in the future in an organization that's going to spill over? How can we hit a common goal? How can we hit a shared goal if everyone's in survival mode? So when you think about hope, it's a mandatory skill. I interviewed some military leaders, and they said hope that whole idea that hope isn't a strategy. They say hope is the only strategy. How do we send people in mission critical situations where it could be life or death and they are hopeless? I mean, think about that extrapolated into you leading a team to launch something that's innovative or taking risks. If they don't have
Mm.
hope, they're not going to be able to connect. And when we try to build hope, it's actually easy to operationalize. It's three components. It's Snyder's hope theory, which is, setting a goal in the first place. Most people don't even set goals within their
Yeah.
organizations. Then it's giving people the agency to get there. So not micromanaging the process. And then it's about creating multiple pathways to those goals. So, you're going to work with someone on your team and think about what that goal looks like, or your, leadership team, and you're going to say, okay, here's a plan A. And if you only have a plan A and it fails, that's only going to lead to more cognitive hopelessness. You need to have a plan B, a plan C, a plan Z. And if you have all of these backups that are at the ready, your brain turns into this psychologically safe place where it relies on these backup plans. And you can do that in 20 minutes or less, with your leader just coming up with these plans and then celebrating the milestones much quicker than we do. We celebrate, when we hit a milestone, a big project
Yeah.
kicks off. It could be 2 years and we're finally having a celebration, or we finally get that $1 million deal. It could be a year and a half before we've
Yeah.
actually, can celebrate that. We should be celebrating weekly goals, monthly goals, yearly goals, and 5-year goals, and be constantly reminding people that there's hope, that they've done a good job, that they're continuing to hit those moments, those milestones, and that makes a huge, difference.
I'm going to segue now into proactive coping. I thought this was fascinating. Our listeners here. Proactive coping, what is it?
Well, it's about setting yourself up to be able to manage the inevitable failures. We're going to
Mm.
have we're going to have moments where we are not going to be able to um we're not going to be able to see the fruits of our labor. And what's happened right now, and hopelessness does that, we've created a sense of learned helplessness.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people are going inside of these organizations, and they're looking to actually, you know hit something that they feel is really important to them. When we talk about purpose in the next chapter, it's like meaning and mattering is so important. But when you aren't allowed to fail, when it's not encouraged for you to actually hit those milestones, you need to be able to have that sense of resiliency and be able to frame the opportunity in a way that I think people are really not able to do right now. They're not feeling supported. They're not feeling like they can take risks. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're in so much uncertainty right now. So we want to be able to sort of, like Amy Edmondson says, it's like this sense of psychological safety that you need to bake into the culture so that people can feel like they can handle it when they meet stress or conflict, or they fail in their goals.
I'm delighted when you mentioned previous guests like Amy Edmondson, and we'll be talking about another guest, Amy Gallo, then later on when we talk about boundaries. You just mentioned purpose there. Now, if I'm a leader listening in, purpose, like, oh, come on, just get on and do the job. Like, what's the case for purpose?
This was really interesting because I had a chance to chat with Adam Grant, and I've chatted with him a few times, and we're sort of on the same page around this idea of what the gap is between executives
Yeah.
and the everyday employee. And when you look at this purpose gap, there was really great research that was done by McKinsey that showed 85% of executives are feeling this sense of purpose on a day-to-day basis, and they're sort of living it out. Whereas 15% of the average employee is feeling a sense of purpose every day. And when you think about that executive, they're really close to the mission. They've really adopted the way, the culture of that organization. They're also going to be more tenured. You also see people that have more tenure. They have much more autonomy. They've also developed their brand at this point. Younger professionals haven't established who they are, so they're trying to, cognitively prove to everyone all the time. It's in the back of their head that, I'm a certain type of employee. So there's a real gap. And what Adam and I agree on is that we have to stop telling people that they should be excited about the mission statement. And that's going to feel weird to a lot of CEOs that think, well, that's the goal. Like how do we have a shared vision? I've created this mission statement. I've created this, this values
Yeah.
profile. But most people just want to feel like they're living their values out on a day-to-day basis. And that's based on, their terminal values and their instrumental values. Instrumental values are the things that we do every single day that connects to the big, hairy, audacious goals that we have. Those terminal values that are the things that we would live and die for. It's like being the best dad I could ever be. It's it's that I really am passionate about solving the climate crisis. I'm gonna help do, the most that I can. I'm going to walk 1,000 miles to help cure cancer. These are the things that matter to us, right? That we're connected to. And the big overall mission doesn't really connect that. And so that's why in organizations, and I also talked to Jen Fisher, who is the former, chief of human sustainability for Deloitte. It's like getting people connected every day to the work that they do and showing how it matters, and also giving them opportunity to connect with the things that they're passionate about. If it's climate change, how do we have an employee resource group that ties that into it? How do we bring in our day-to-day tasks so it feels like they're not mundane and tedious, that they actually have some sort of purpose? Even pay, people say like pay isn't a purpose, but for a lot of the Uber drivers, I interviewed over 100 Uber drivers, having a better life for their kids was extremely purpose driven for them. So driving that car for them was very meaningful because that pay was going to give a better life to their kids. So I think leaders need to do a better job of telling those stories, making people feel like the values that they care about matter, and learning, what it is that lights people up so that we can make sure we're motivating in the right way.
That kind of reminds me of that story where JFK went into NASA and he met the guy sweeping the floor. Do you know the story?
Yeah, it's that this when you feel
Yeah.
like sweeping the floor is the most important job
Yeah.
that you could possibly have, because it's playing a fundamental role for people that are going to come in, to the institution, and
Yeah.
that it's your job to be able to show what really what people are looking to come in and see, what they're
Yeah.
looking to experience. And we saw that too when there was this really great research that was done with people that were working in the hospital. And so I love this story because, it is really just we think that people have a terrible job, and we don't realize how much they actually think it's the best job in the world. And there were these people that were cleaning, they were the cleaning staff in these hospitals. And there were, two groups. One group, when they were interviewed, you asked them about what they were doing, and they would say things like, "Oh, I'm, putting the blankets on the patient, or I am, dusting, or I'm mopping the floors." It was all very much like if you could describe what their job requirements were, they would list them. And then there was this other group, they called themselves the patient ambassadors. And they were the ones that weren't dusting, they were making the room look special so that, when their patients were, which was interesting because they were all in a coma. This wing that they were on, they were all in a coma. They're like, well, this will help them heal. This will make it more likely that they wake up and get out of a coma. And if I tuck them into bed, it isn't just adjusting the sheets, it's tucking them into bed. It's changing the flowers so that it smells better for them in the room. When those that call themselves patient ambassadors, it was like the guy, sweeping when JFK, asked them about that. It's that I am doing something that is meaningful. And job satisfaction was the highest that they'd seen. And comparatively to those that were just listing out the things they do, you saw retention completely different in that group that called themselves the patient ambassadors. The job was
Mhm.
exactly the same. Morale was improved, everything that you can imagine that you want from a business outcome. And it's all about looking at the things that you do every single day as having a purpose.
This reminds me of your colleague Adam Grant that we just discussed, and his research went into fundraising teams, and when the benefactors of the fundraising they heard the stories, then that was really motivational for fundraisers then to make those phone calls, and hit their targets. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
This is really fundamental because I talk about storytelling, right? And then
Mm,
there's the piece that Adam Grant talks about is this idea that, if you have the knowledge of what the impact is, it's going to make such a big difference between whether you are, you know, just getting on a call. I mean, the increase in impact went way up. The fundraising dollars went way up when people knew why they were doing what they were doing. And, there's been other, and I include another story in the book as well, the story of when, the president of this manufacturing company, his dad passed away and he was seeing morale get lost on the factory floor, went and started talking to his customers. And he had this incredible moment where one of his, customers said that he was a farmer. Fortunately, I think this is really critical is that the type of product that they were making in this factory was farming equipment for farmers with disabilities. And this customer had lost his mobility. And when that equipment came in, he was able to keep the farm. His wife was buried there because she was also lost in the car accident that,
yeah.
impacted him and made his mobility. He lost his mobility. And so, his kids didn't have to leave the place where their mom was buried. All of this, like that is just so impactful, but we don't often hear about that. And when he brought that back to the floor and people that were stamping sheet metal found out that, this thing that they did every day actually made this come true for one of their customers, it changed everything. And it's similar with what Adam Grant has studied. And, in when you look at business outcomes, the factory started changing, the morale was
Mhm.
completely different. It changed entirely. You saw an increase in morale. You saw better retention, but you also saw an attraction of more
Mhm.
really great talent because they felt like, oh, this is a place. If I'm going to choose between one factory and another, I want to work with in the factory that
Yeah.
that you're doing something special. And we don't do that enough in our organizations to bring the impact back, bring the stories back. It's just sort of assumed that it should be a transactional relationship, but we've moved into this desire for a social contract with work. And it's about, knowing that something that we're doing every day is having an impact, especially like that. It can change all of those business outcomes.
You mentioned Jen Fisher of Deloitte earlier on, and that reminded me of the Deloitte Wizards. Tell us about Deloitte Wizard. I think our listeners would love this.
I love that. There's 5,000 well-being wizards at Deloitte, which is incredible. And yeah, Jen was sort of running that ERG, that employee resource group. And what I think is so cool about this group is that they would support you from a well-being standpoint. They had, training in mental health 101. So if you were in a
Mhm.
situation, you could essentially go to a place within their internal system and have an anonymous or a conversation with a peer if you were really struggling. And when you look actually at burnout prevention and even just fixing burnout after you've hit that wall, peer support is one of the number one ways to help people get out of a burnout cycle. And so the fact that it's a peer that you can just talk to is really meaningful, but also there was this space where people would feel frustrations and they could just go to one of the wizards to see if there could be
Yeah.
help for something that they're, like a broken
Yeah.
down printer can be the most frustrating thing. Those types of things that they could just help with. And it was like using the strengths and the talents and the smarts of all of these incredibly talented people, and then just being able to problem solve. One of the things in the burnout epidemic I write about are about pebbles that turn into boulders. So you've got these tiny pebbles
Yeah.
and they seem innocuous, they're just sort of irritating in
Yeah.
your shoe. But at work, when those pebbles aren't being resolved, they turn into
Yeah.
these boulders that completely crush culture. And so
Yeah.
being able to solve that, just like,
Yeah.
connect to one of these wizards that's going to help you solve a problem, it leads to burnout prevention in this really cool way. And I don't even think that, Jen and the team really recognize that, but I don't even know if it's really a conscious thing. It just happens to really work well.
I might point listeners to an episode that I recorded on micro stressors at work with Rob Cross, just on those little pebbles. It's a really good read, the good book, and the podcast is there to support that. You mentioned peer support there, Jennifer, and this reminds me of the chapter then on community. Now, I'm just kind of going community, like it's so seems so fragmented from the pandemic, the challenges of hybrid working, you know, all that's going on, and then it's like, well, how do I know I want to connect with someone? And then you talk about the different dynamics with relationships, and we talk about, I like someone because they're competent or they're reliable. Can you just go into that? Because honestly, I was just highlighting word after word, page after page of this. This just chapter is just rich with content, especially if you want to create that sense of belonging at work. So can we do a deep dive into that if that's okay?
Yeah, I think the community chapter and just the loss of community is a
Yeah.
major factor right now
Mm.
in people's disengagement. A
Yeah.
lot of what work used to feel like was, there'd be forced fun and you'd be sort of annoyed being called to the kitchen to have to celebrate three people's birthdays and there'd be terrible
Yeah.
slab cake, that you have to eat.
Yeah.
And we didn't like that. We'd roll our eyes, but there's been so many people that have sort of secretly said, like, please bring that back because it would
Yeah.
lead to some ad hoc conversations where you go to the desk and you'd chat and you learn about someone, dealing with a sick kid, or you'd be able to provide some advice, or you'd find out that someone watched a movie that you really love too. These are those moments, those serendipitous moments that have been totally lost in the last 5 years. And it's easy to blame it on hybrid and remote work, but I blame it on overwork and the fact that
Yeah.
we have 252% more meetings. That was the increase in 1 year. We used to have 45 billion meeting minutes a year, which was a lot. Now it's 215 billion meeting minutes. It's that we don't have any time. We're time starved. And this time poverty is forcing us to do things like dining al desco. We're eating at our desk all day. No one gets up from their desk. We're going into an office space where we should be collaborative and connecting. And instead, what we're doing is we're like sitting side by side doing the exact same work we could be doing at home. So the office hasn't changed. And this is one of those novel things that we need a new framework for. The office is not the same thing. We're still in these kind of video conferencing world, but we're physically connected. And then I think one of the coolest learnings that I had was how we've moved so far into only having simplex relationships, which is just
Yeah.
transactional relationships, to and farther away from multiplex relationships, which is, William, I know about you and I know that you read a book a week. I
Yeah.
know certain aspects about your life that make it so that we aren't just transacting with each other. And when we're just transacting with each other, we don't have the same empathy for each other. We don't give each other the same grace. We likely aren't going to step away from our desks to have lunch together or connect. We're going to feel lonelier because we don't really care about that transactional relationship like we would a multiplex relationship. And that learning for me was really huge because the way that we're even attracted to other people to become friends in the organization is based on, what we learn is this a competent, accountable personality trait. When I think about going out at night on a Friday night to hang out with my best buddies from work, I don't want to be with the accountable, competent one. I want to be with someone like that I get along with that makes me laugh. And,
Yeah.
that's great if they have that as like a tertiary, personality trait, like that's fine. But to really bond, you need to be connected on a deeper level. And so we're just seeing so much of that network disappear. We're seeing the relationships dissolve, and work has become like going to school without art, gym, or recess. It's just lonely and disconnected and no fun. And that makes us detached from it.
And that's where the point that you make here in the book is social engineering, and how I see that is it's a bit like you're knitting back the social fabric of the organization. You're creating ways for those social collisions to happen. So we are taking that time to really connect. And this is where you start in the introduction that we're prioritizing productivity over connection. And then we've all these outcomes that we can't directly measure because we've conflict in teams, we're not collaborating, we don't trust. So social engineering, then tell me a little bit more about that. That sounds a bit manipulative, if I'm honest.
Yeah. That idea of we sort of have to do that now.
Yeah.
I had a great conversation with Robin Dunbar. He is an anthropologist well known for the Dunbar number and how
Yeah.
many friends that we should have at any one time, and that our village is about 125 people. And I found it so fascinating because he said we've lost the village. And part of that is that we used to network, and this is why we've seen, interestingly, males that are typically in the middle management and moving to executive level, their network has shrunk in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And women's have expanded in a way because the way that they're social is a bit different, and they really have long-term social connections. They sort of hold on to their friendships, but
Yeah.
so much of what we used to do was based on activities together. We had activity-based networking, and that would create the opportunity for us to have this. And it sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but it's like planned serendipity.
Okay.
What I love about what Google did with Project Aristotle, they just by chance learned that if they slowed the lunch lines down, that it would, because it was moving too fast and there wasn't enough people that were actually going and sitting in the lunchroom to eat and talk. Innovation
Yeah.
went down when the lunch lines went too fast. But when they slowed the lunch lines down, more people would create a conversation because they had time in line. And then that led them to stay in the lunchroom and talk and innovate. And so, again, social engineering, but when you think about it, and Atlassian does the same thing where they have team together events, and they were measuring things like ad hoc coffees after these togetherness events. What happened is ad hoc coffees between, peers increased by 3 times. So it is creating the opportunity, like recess, bringing recess back for
Yeah.
us to maybe stand and be awkward for a bit, but then come together. And that's why we have to look at creating rituals. So it's like the rituals have to start, we have to bring them back. Some organizations I talked to would do like an Iron Chef once a month, or, they would do a movie club, or they would ask first, like, what are we interested in? And then they would start establishing rituals. And then what happens is this social contagion theory. Yale, Harvard, Christakis Fowler research, really cool, around the happiness contagion. They found that happiness is contagious. And one of the things is that if you create these rituals and people see that it's like fun, They're
Yeah.
drawn to it, right? And so you create a bit of a network effect and that spreads. And then what is so cool about humans is we have this conservation of resources theory. This is the part where FOMO comes from. And
Yeah.
it is actually a thing that humans genetically have is this FOMO. Because when you see like this one little thing happens, right?
Yeah.
I kind of liken it to being at a wedding, and then there's
Yeah.
people dancing. There's only three people dancing, and then all of a sudden, like a few more people come on the dance floor, and then all of a sudden, it's like Aunt Linda's twerking. She never dances ever, and the whole
Yeah.
place, you know, like fleeing to the dance floor. The conservation of resources theory is that when there's energy that we see it because humans cannot survive without energy, our innate instinct is to get closer to it. We want to
Yeah.
conserve it because it's good for our survival. So we need to establish social engineering is establishing the ritual, getting more people to feel good by it, feel
Yeah.
enthusiastic. They're spreading that contagion, which makes people feel a sense of FOMO, want to be around that. They want to feel that energy. And then you create social and relational energy back at work. And it's simple. It's like 20 minutes of lunch once a week with one person can create it. Having lunch within a group can create that ritual and social contagion and conservation of resources that moves the sort of the culture towards a positive direction. But it's just intentional. It's incremental. It takes time.
Yeah.
It's not just like a silver bullet thing. It's not technology. It's those like analog behaviors that we need to reestablish that we're all missing.
And that's where those elements of relational cadence comes in, relational confidence comes in. So it's the number of times we meet, and then the relational confidence. Then, if I'm correct, it's that we trust the people that we're with, that we know that we're kind of safe to approach them on something or to reveal information about themselves or myself. Is that
That's
it?
absolutely true. Information passes faster because
Yeah.
you get to know someone.
Yeah.
You learn about them, so you have higher cohesion, which is extremely important, and we're seeing a real lack of cohesion. And
Yeah.
we're even finding that return to office mandates, getting people actually physically in the space is reducing team cohesion because we're not doing this part of it. And so we need to do this part of it, like establishing rituals, going into the office that for reasons of team building, of bonding, of even work sprints, working
Yeah.
together in a shared space where we're collaborating, where we have time for creativity with each other, and that is not happening because we're over meeting, we're not efficient, we're exhausted. And what happens when you are in a state of time poverty, you actually question the value of your time differently. Because if it
Yeah.
means, oh, I'm going to have 20 minutes of lunch, but then I have to work in my pajamas, you look at that as, I'm not going to risk that. That
Yeah.
social energy is depleted. But it also leads to things like more shorthand. So that, again, efficacy and efficiency improves
Yeah.
because you had lunch with someone for 20 minutes once a week. The
Yeah.
culture changes, and then everything just moves faster. You have psychological safety, so you're going to innovate more, you feel
Yeah.
less risk. And then you also feel like people have a kind of a description of culture, like when it's good, it's just like you just feel it. You just feel it in the energy of the people. That's social relational energy, and that's something that happens when you actually intentionally invest in it, when you feel like you have the time wealth to be able to engage in it.
And something I want to build on there, in this section of the book, I may be incorrect. I remember spreading positive gossip. So I remember working with a company that did this, and it said gossiping success. And this is where it goes back to that motivational piece
Uh,
then as well, is let me, did you hear about what this person did? Isn't that great? And then we don't always have to be waiting for our managers to give us recognition. Then we're getting recognition from our peers then, and then once we do that, that creates that virtuous cycle where we're creating that community. Can you tell us a little bit more about positive gossip?
this is one of my favorite pieces of research. It's just so fun. And I think what I love about what's the book has sort of ended up being, and I keep saying 20 minutes or less, but it's about culture actually being able to be impacted in a very easy lift kind of way. It's not hard. It's not an overhaul. It's, people feel like the idea of culture is so nebulous and so frightening because it feels like we're moving such a big ship. But it
Yeah.
really is just these small incremental ways. And positive gossip is another example of that. And the research found that when people talk nicely behind each other's back, it's as simple as that. You just say nice things about people.
Yeah.
And it isn't the goal about it getting back to them. That's always great when it does. But really, it really is about people that onboard. What they found is that they perceived, and again, psychology, perception, and reality
Yeah.
are the
Yeah.
exact same, emotional state in the brain. So you
Mhm.
perceive someone to be speaking nicely about you behind your back. Again, whether it's real or perceived, it changes how you feel around innovation inside the organization because you take more risks, you feel more psychologically safe, you feel like this is a place that is open, it's warm,
Mm.
it's kind. And so they looked at a comparison around onboarding. Onboarding was so much quicker for new employees and getting them up to speed and getting them ready to
Yeah.
go and having the knowledge that they need and the resources that they need to do their job. It was so much faster in environments where there was positive gossip. And when you look at the flip side of the six root causes of burnout, lack of recognition, lack of reward and recognition are really a big factor in burnout. So those organizations where there's toxic gossip, that's
Yeah.
terrible. I mean, it
Yeah.
really has an impact. Environments where there's toxic gossip, it actually decreases a person's lifespan. That's how detrimental it is on our health. But having positive gossip, it also increases things like life satisfaction. So it's outside the
Mhm.
domain of work. And it's very simple. It's like a couple minutes a day that you can just say a nice thing behind someone's back. But that's atrophied. We're not, again, it's a muscle that we're not using. When you're time starved, you're not thinking, oh, I need to take an email and thank someone, or
Yeah.
I'm not going to necessarily do that. When you're burned out, you become very isolated. You're in
Yeah.
survival mode. You're actually you're socially depleted. You're not as grateful. You're not seeing what you have
Yeah.
versus what you don't have. So the idea to recognize someone becomes almost impossible for that person. So we need to deal with the hygiene to make sure that we're doing things right there and doing these incremental shifts so that it creates
Mhm.
this contagion where people feel like they have more time, they want to be kinder, they feel
Yeah.
like they want to reward and recognize someone, and they are more social, so they care about their peers.
It is very tempting for senior leaders to focus on productivity and not think of the long-term effects that it has on the organization. And this is where you quote Amy Gallo then, because sometimes we have to have a difficult conversation about boundaries, whether it's techno stress or work overload, or maybe it's toxic gossip. Y- You know, what can we learn from Amy Gallo then about that?
I love Amy just as a professional. She's so incredibly, rich
Yeah.
in what she has to say, and I think it's so relevant. I mean, we're just not going to have everyone be our best friend at work. That's
Mm.
unnatural. It's like
Yeah.
cohabitating. You're going to, feel frustrated with people. And the idea that it's just going to be this sort of Pollyanna experience where everyone's kumbaya and happy, I think that's actually works against the success of the organization. You need to
Yeah.
have the ability to provide upward feedback. You need to be able to have rich discussions that might be dissenting and are
Mm.
difficult. And I think what Amy talks a lot about in her book is this way of recognizing that conflict is healthy and having hard discussions is necessary for you to have true psychological safety. That's when you can have those conversations. When you don't have psychological safety, you do not feel like you can actually dissent. And this is another thing that I loved when you looked at, NASA's Challenger crash and they came in and looked at culture after that crash. And what they found is that people did not feel like they could have dissension. And that
Yeah.
led, to the crash. And so there's real impacts that we can have in an organization where, conflict isn't supported. And the thing is that, too, I loved Anita Williams Woolley's research on this idea of collective intelligence.
Yeah.
When you have more higher performing teams, it usually means that the collective intelligence is higher. And that means that people take their turns while speaking. So that's a big part of it, so that you listen
Yeah.
to each other. But you also have this diverse thought. It's about getting work done that actually builds the relationship and the happiness at work. So having a structured way of being able to dissent is a
Yeah.
big part of it. And one of the things that I think is really cool is having, like, I say it's like the RBG, black robe of dissension meeting.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
you have, once a month, you actually have someone play the role of the dissenter. You take a big topic, something that might be difficult to have a conversation around, something that there's tension around. I mean, AI is a great example right now of,
Yeah.
and there's people have lots of feelings about it. So let's take a topic and give people, or give someone, it has to rotate, but give that person in that month the ability to put on the robe of dissension and play the devil's advocate. And I think that when you do that, when you arm people with this ability to conflict and learn how to actually have healthy debate, this is where it becomes much more approachable and easier to have conflict in organizations. And then what we've seen with this, dissension meeting is it
Yeah.
leads to so many more fixes of problems. It leads
Yeah.
people to actually be able to say something that might be really impactful. It might not be life or death like at NASA, but it could
Yeah.
be, really pivotal to a project succeeding or failing. And so we need a little bit more of that constructive opportunity to dissent, but in a safe way. So it isn't just it's festering and then
Yeah.
someone explodes, which is
Yeah.
really toxic.
From a practical point of view, from my learnings, the cloak of dissension should be shared around amongst the whole team, that distributed leadership, because it's unfair on one person just to always be the devil's advocate, because it's a huge emotional burden on them as well, because they're fighting against the bias of the group. They're going to go, hey, the group think we want this. It's the easiest answer. Let's go. So there is some learning in that. No, no, you just mentioned AI there. There's actually two acronyms that I've learned from this book. One is FOBO and one is BYOAI. So we have the fear of becoming obsolete, and the other one is bring your own AI. So let's discuss that, because we cannot have this discussion right now, because we talked about liquid times, AI. Okay, so how's that going to help us in the workplace or not?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned liquid times, because Baumeister's idea of, the fact that we can be in a state of grounding, which was
Yeah,
2019. We felt
yeah,
like we had the frameworks ish. I mean, it was not
yeah,
perfect, but we felt like we had a good idea. The office had been around for about 550 years, so we kind of felt like, okay, we'd figure that out.
mm,
Um, but 2020 just shook that all up. And when we're in liquid times, it feels like all those frameworks are gone. And then what we also saw in this state of uncertainty was this rapid AI acceleration. When,
yeah,
you look, and I put some data in the book around CEOs, that when they talked about the biggest disruptors, technology in 2019 was there, but
yeah,
it wasn't even in the top six when you look at the
mm,
six big disruptors. It shot in the last 3 years from six to number one.
mm,
And it's really AI. And what is created is this fear of becoming obsolete, this FOBO.
mm,
And Gallup, and Microsoft Trends, LinkedIn reports says 1 in 2 people across the global workforce is feeling AI anxiety. I mean, that's significant. And we know when people feel obsolete, it makes them feel hopeless. It makes them feel
mm,
afraid of the future. They
yeah,
disengage, they're disconnected. And when we look at what's happening as far as strategies are concerned, in that same report, they said, 60 50% plus CEOs have no idea really what the strategy is. So
Yeah.
we felt this pressure to adopt it just without really thinking about the why.
Yeah.
And that why of AI is so critical when you look at like the purpose gap between
Yeah.
executives, and those people in the front lines. If we don't know why, all we're going to assume is the worst. We're going to catastrophize. We're already in a state of, liquid modernity,
Yeah.
which means that you
Yeah.
do become much more
Yeah.
survival mode. You stop feeling loyal to,
Yeah.
to institutions. You lack trust in institutions. And so here we are, we're like, what is the point? Is this
Yeah.
going to take over my job? What I've also seen in the interviews that I've done is people saying, well, when we did have AI, it did actually take away some of my mundane and boring tasks. That was good,
Mm.
but I've not been reskilled so I can actually. The promise of AI was that I could be creative and,
Yeah.
would take this boring stuff away and then I could do these
Yeah.
other cool things. And instead, they're trying to pretend that they're working. They're masking their tasks.
Yeah.
Task masking is a big thing right now because
Yeah.
we haven't delivered on the promise of AI. And so you've got that. And then you've got people not even knowing what AI is in their life and what that technology is. This
Yeah.
BYOAI to work, we're
Yeah.
looking at 78% of people are BYOAI to work. Think about the security threat that is.
Yeah.
Think about the risk that is to organizations where people are just thinking that they're not even using AI or they're not even bringing it to work. This was another
Yeah.
cool data point where you
Yeah.
ask people if they're using AI and in the data they were like, 50% said no. But then when you actually started to give them what AI is and the technology that we use kind
Yeah.
of ubiquitously in our lives, 98% said I'm using AI.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't even really know what it is. And we've just moved too fast and we've adopted in a way that hasn't actually been successful. And we need to take a step back and really communicate if there's a why, what that looks like, and how people's lives are going to be impacted, and making sure that we're delivering on the promise of, reskilling and upskilling, which we're in dramatic, desperation for in the next 20 years.
We talk about skilling and reskilling. For me, I go through flipping between I'm going to be out of job to actually going to go and I'm actually very safe. And the reason I think I'm very safe is I've learned so many skills and keep learning all the time. And I'm quite motivated to do that on a regular basis. But large organizations, like how can they leverage technology to create that learning culture, for example?
I think that's a really important question because we've not allowed for a state of curiosity when it
Mm.
comes to this new technology. And, before we've had technology implemented and it's maybe a process and it's a very
Yeah.
specific way that we have to use this technology to
Yeah.
execute on a certain process, compliance, for example. So the technology you're not really going to be curious with it. It isn't an
Yeah.
experimental technology. But I mean, Gen AI is definitely an experimental technology. We should be giving people as middle managers, as leaders, give people an opportunity to say, like, what could be the best way that I could time save? Go
Yeah.
out and explore different AI tools and see how it might interact with your job. Have little managers creating career pathways that look at what do I want to do if I have these other aspects of my job solved for.
Yeah.
Like if I've been doing data input and I now have someone or not someone, but an AI that can do that for me. Now, what do I want to do? Oh, do I want to be able to read the data and deliver on the insights? Well, that's a really good, move from being in this spot of just doing, data gathering to now being able
Yeah.
to actually read the data. And so we have to ask employees what they want to do with this, how they can actually be autonomously learning what the technology is, and then they're enrolled in it being part of their career journey. And it solves a lot of what managers and I think leaders are fearful of is like they just don't know how to take on such an enormous cultural shift. But if you leave, this permission-based exploration and this curiosity, it makes it so that it makes sense. And I think we also need to have better guidelines around what's safe, what's not safe, what are the expectations of you, what should we be using Otter AI in a, meeting where we're talking about IP? Probably not. Should we,
Yeah.
be able to plug and play some of our most protected data into
Yeah.
ChatGPT? Probably not a good idea, and people are doing that. Like they're creating PowerPoint presentations to talk about something, but they're taking, proprietary information and plugging it into chat. And I think that we're putting the company at risk through this adoption and acceptance of AI. So it's a, it's so new. And we feel, this is a frustrating thing that I feel about this last 5 years, is that people are acting like, okay, now we all have it all figured out. 5 years later from the pandemic, like,
Yeah.
I've got all of this figured out. Let's do it this way. Like, this is the formula. We are in the most agile, fluid, experimental time of work that we've been ever, maybe. And so this idea of not being agile and fluid to the learnings and then being able to iterate and change, this idea of being married to a framework is just so inefficient. And I think it's just a really bad attitude that some leaders have. They need to be very humble right now and curious themselves and be able to take what they've learned and apply it and be able to change as they learn.
So I found Jennifer Kickbox was another wonderful initiative when it came to learning and development.
Yeah, I love this a case study, and there's a lot of other case studies that are very similar. The ones that saw the most success in the adoption was that they would highlight where it's worked and where it hasn't, and then there was like a lot of examples of, you know, um, experimentation, but then being very open to things not working, and then they would eliminate that, but then they would adopt in the examples that really worked, and then they would trial it. We saw a lot of really great examples of people that would trial it, and then they would give it a chance for, say, a month or 6 weeks. And if it didn't work, then they would abandon it, which I think is really great. But then if it really worked in a pilot, they would figure out ways to be able to assimilate that within other parts of the organization. And what they also did is they did a lot of peer learning. So people that really had a good sense of a certain tool, they would put these ad hoc learning sessions on. So you'd be learning from your peer, which the research shows that if you are just learning from someone else that you trust in the organization, you're much more likely to be enrolled in it than if it's a top down, here's a product that we want you to use, or here's how we're using AI. If you have this commitment to learning and openness to learning, it changes everything. Google does a really good job of that too. They really have a lot of smart people there. They attract, super smart people. Atlassian, same thing. Like these organizations where they have people that are already, advanced scientists working in this space, and they're just sitting around a room that you can drop in on and learn about it in a very practical way. I mean, that is, I think, an environment that we all should be creating. And it's also, there's an enthusiasm for learning. We've seen training and development budgets slashed. It's even worse than we've seen it ever before. And so when you have an environment that's all about learning, where it really is not just, it's like, and there's an enthusiasm, but there's an expectation that we're always going to be learning, it completely changes the rate of adoption and acceptance of new technology. I mean, Google's an example and Kickbox is an example, but they're tech companies, so it's a little bit different. We're seeing this though in other places like banking, and financial institutions. And when we're seeing that kind of shift, like ING is a great example where you see things happening in places that don't tend to necessarily be as curious or open, that's where you're really going to see the barriers to adoption erode. And we need to also think differently. There's a lot of conversation about reverse mentorship, and I don't like that term. I don't want us to use that term anymore. This idea of reverse mentorship kind of feels like, mature workers don't know much about tech, but our younger
Yeah.
workers
Yeah.
do. And instead, it should just be across the board. I mean, you think of Dr. Hinton, the founder of AI. I mean, he's in his late 60s and he knows a lot more than I
Yeah.
possibly do, or most Gen Zs about AI. So I really think, where organizations do it well, Kickbox, Google, others, ING, and banking institutions, it is where you just have people that are doing cool things that know a lot about something. They're trialing it and they're sharing transparently along the way how it's working, that you just see more people excited about technology.
This was something that was afforded to you many years ago, is just go off, learn that, come back, share it with us. And that's that ritual that seems to have been lost, hasn't it?
It is, I mean, again, we're time starved. So this
Yeah.
idea of hosting learning or people even attending a learning, it was really
Mm.
interesting. Just anecdotally, I'll share this with you, William. Like there was this 1 month of learning and I was part of it, in this group um and they were really focusing on just all different types of learning for a whole month. And they had this new space. This is an organization that I went and spoke at. They had this huge space built for learning. Like it was there and they were bringing people in. But, when I showed up, it was a big deal because there's a bunch of people in person that were physically attending this talk that I gave. I guess every other one had, maybe about four or five people in it. A lot of people were sitting at their desks, maybe, listening in, or it was
Yeah.
recorded, so they may or may not connect
Yeah.
into it later. But the reason for it was they're just really busy, so they're going to do it in their own time. And I
Mm.
think, people coming together to actually develop skills and to learn and to be able to have conversations with one another, that is actually how you retain knowledge. That is how you take what that person is sharing with you or that learning and you apply it. When you're just sort of half listening, on uh, whatever while you're eating your lunch and doing some other work, you're not retaining that knowledge. And so the more that we have time that we're giving people, but we're also saying, no, we're going to do this together
Yeah.
in person as a team. I think that's critical. I guess you don't do that necessarily in all remote environments, but even digital first companies like Atlassian, when they're doing learning, they bring people into the office spaces that they built, their satellite offices. They understand that work can still happen remotely, but there is an element of learning together that actually changes the dynamic of the organization. And we need to build in time for that. And we need to say, nope, like we're going to give you space. We're going to make sure that your workload is managed this week. We're going to take a bunch of stuff off your plate and you're going to just focus on learning.
I think I'm going to take that clip and send it to every client that I know that has said, "Can you do this in an hour?" And we do it remote. And there's something about getting together and really understanding and engaging with the challenges that the organization has. You providing as the expert some frameworks, some discussion points. Let's tease this out. And then by learning together, then we're keeping the learning alive going back into the workplace. Do you remember what Jennifer said, or do you remember what William said? I think this is an opportunity where we could have a discussion to implement this learning, or to utilize it in a different way. Also, on that, is there are certain people, and I think it's coming more and more, where the expectations is there's a demand for autonomy and freedom. And again, there's particularly interesting insights that you have from Isaiah Berlin about negative and positive freedom and liberty. Do you mind going through that? Because I was, boom, mind blown on this.
The chapter on freedom was my most aha moment for me.
Yeah.
It was like that for me, writing it and learning about Isaiah Berlin's work, but was actually in a conversation with Adam Grant where he talks about freedom from and freedom to, and this idea of
Mm.
like we want to be, free from toxic environments. We want to be
Yeah.
free from burnout. We want to be free from overwork. And then
Mm.
we want to be able to have like freedom to be able to, work with people that give us joy and, freedom to be able to, you know, be hired as an adult and treated as an adult.
Yeah.
If you're being trusted to be paid a whole bunch of money and to come in and work towards the organizational vision, then you need to be trusted that, that you're going to get your work done. And so this idea of like, freedom and that the way that it's so hardwired, it's a big part of why we're seeing so much resistance to everything that was given and then taken away. And that's where I feel like right now we're in this place where there's a disconnect between leaders and employees and employers and employees, because employers have this idea that, it's again that transactional relationship, like, we should just be happy to have a job, or, we're paying you, this is the expectation, and this is how it was before. Like,
Yeah.
deal with it. You worked in the office all the time before. So what if you worked remote for a period of time? Just come
Yeah.
back. That hardwire sense of freedom, it's literally back to the days in the savannas, where if there was something that was potentially coming at us and risking our freedom, we would fight to our own personal peril to hold on to it. And
Yeah.
so a lot of this mindset right now is very subconscious. We were given this flexibility and able to work autonomously, but now we're going back to that. It isn't just, oh, I want to work in my pajamas, I'm lazy, entitled.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
gave me something. I know what that feels like. And now you're taking my freedom away.
Yeah.
And it's, oh, we invested in well-being. That was a big investment that we put in. We had these,
Yeah.
support programs. We cared about your well-being. Oh, I'm going to take that back. And all of the entire team that is
Yeah.
managing that, which says to me, we gave you this freedom, like wellness was important. Oh, taking that away. So you've got that now. DEI, we invested in diversity. We invested in, making sure that women were, we're not at the narrowest pipeline we've seen for executive women in the history, of the
Yeah.
workforce. Well, other than when women just first began to actually
Yeah.
work, but we're seeing some of the worst data on, representation of women CEOs globally in last decade. You gave that to us. We felt a sense of, freedom that we were being given, that we were going to move
Yeah.
up. Now it's taken away. Imagine that you're just pulling away something that people feel is fundamentally theirs. And how do
Yeah.
you not expect there to be resistance to that?
Yeah.
So, when we are bringing back policy, or when we're thinking about policy as leaders, we need to understand that there's a psychological barrier that runs very deep that we can't just click off. That it's not possible right now to jam that toothpaste back in the tube. It's not like Severance where we're, bifurcating between,
Yeah.
being like our innie and like we just only know what we know at work, and then our outie, knows only
Yeah.
what it knows out at work. That's what it seems like organizations really are trying to do right now, is create this
Yeah.
Severance style return
Yeah.
to normal. And I think that it's easy to be hyperbolic around certain generations, like the lazy entitled Gen Zs and all of that.
Yeah.
But when you look at the data across the board, this changed us. This sense of mortality
Yeah.
facing moment, this looking at the finitude of our lives and saying, I want more, and being given that and then having that taken away. That's a really critical piece that I think is missing from leaders' knowledge right now. And they're wondering how to fix it. There's ways to fix it, but it's first understanding that that is a massive psychological barrier that they need to get through.
Just for our listeners who don't know what Severance is, it's a TV show about the workplace, an imaginary workplace at that, on Apple. I think it's Apple, isn't it?
It is Apple
TV.
TV, yes.
Okay. So just on that, deepening the leadership understanding of what's going on, then this is where you talk about social identity theory, optimal distinctiveness, and psychological reactance. Am I correct in saying that you break it down in that, like, if I was a listener and I'm a leader and I'm like, no, like everybody back to the workplace, and we'll talk about the third space in a minute, but in that, then it's like, well, what else do I need to understand with those elements then at play?
Well, it's interesting because 60% of the workforce is not remote enabled. So,
Yeah,
understanding that freedom isn't just where. And I think
yeah,
that's really critical. It isn't just where we physically work. If it's flexibility, and that discussion and freedom has become just
yeah,
about three things, I feel like: remote, hybrid,
yeah,
in person. But it is about, okay, how do we think about freedom as, what we do? What are we doing? Are we actually working on what is going to be the best case scenario for us and our values, our career pathing? All of
yeah,
that really matters. And then it's with whom. I include data in there around just even having buddy systems and even having a
mm,
friend that you work with that you're really closely aligned to
yeah,
in warehouses and manufacturing. Having a choice in with whom you work with can make a
yeah,
huge difference in risk. Like safety measures were improved. When you look at Patagonia, for example, they have 15 different options for how you can select your shift in the retail dimension. So
yeah,
you're giving people huge amount of freedom in choosing, when they work, how they work,
yeah,
what they're doing. And so we need to start thinking about, that in that way. And then we also need to recognize that the office is really become a place of kind of exclusion. We're missing the community.
yeah,
We're having, these efforts in DEI being pulled back. So there's a
yeah,
symbolism there that's making people feel disaggregated, which is a real problem. And then we're overworked, so we're not actually connecting in any way while we're
yeah,
at work. And so what's happened is people have felt very othered, very
mm,
disconnected, polarized. We have generational divides, which are also playing a big role
yeah,
in that. And so what we need to do is actually create what is called, optimal distinctiveness, where this is idea that people all want to be the same and they all want to be different
yeah,
simultaneously. We all
yeah,
want to be unique and
yeah,
stand out, and we all want to feel like we fit in. And it needs to be kind of like an effortless state of belonging, that feeling
yeah,
where it's not like we have been doing. This is the big problem, is that a lot of the initiatives, especially around making people feel belonging, has been
mm,
to other them, has been
yeah,
creating in and out groups. The out group is the one that has bias and they should be shamed for
yeah,
things that they didn't really know that they were doing.
yeah,
And then it's like these other groups, were highlighting them as being very distinctively other, and they're better,
yeah,
but in a way that's not right. Like, I was so proud to win the International Female Entrepreneur of the Year award. I wish I just won the International Entrepreneur of the Year award. And
yeah,
so, why do we have to have these different disclaimers? Instead, it should be a belonging. Is like there's no groups. People are
yeah,
just fitting in and standing out at the same time. And
yeah,
that's why I love, Bill Gates does a really good job of like, well, he, used to, that was his thing. It was like every single week he'd call out someone who had done a really good thing. And leaders can play a role in making sure that there is a lot of diversity and describing who is doing a cool, awesome thing. And then it becomes that it's about the work. It's about
yeah,
how great of a job you did. So no one's wondering if you should have had that job because of a certain, disclaimer, certain
yeah,
demographic data. And I think that we need to do more around that belonging piece by reducing the othering, which we're seeing a lot of, and making it more about how do we have a shared vision? How do we connect together in a way that's about the work? Because that's
yeah,
unifying. When we are
yeah.
successful in an organization and we do good work together, that is unifying. And it takes away all that other, unimportant data.
And finally, is there any other ways we can boost belonging then at work?
Oh gosh, there's, myriad ways. And I talk about that again
Yeah,
in the book. But I think that one of the most important things for us to be able to do is, again, that storytelling, really being able to not just talk about who's doing good things, but making sure that we're sharing stories that are diverse. Also, making sure that we are building in time for belonging.
yeah,
Like, this is a thing that we don't, everything we need to build in time to be able to do, but we need to build in time for us to actually just learn about each other. There's this whole thing around, empathy that I talk about, and compassion is really like, taking the listening and then putting it into action. We need to listen, and then we need to change, what are the problem spaces, by what we've in action, what we've heard. And there's been a lot of listening, but the compassion piece where we've actioned it has been really lost. And I think that, when we develop multiplex relationships, when we make time for learning about different ideas and diverse ideas, and also the dissension, the meeting really helps for belonging. But if we are able to just learn how we're the same and all of our similarities versus how different we are, that is a big factor. I keep saying too, like, we really need to do a narrative audit. This idea where we go around and we're like, oh, millennials, it's this whole headline, millennials could afford a home if they just didn't buy so much avocado toast, and
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
And boomers can't Google. We have to look at this, and that ageism is the last socially acceptable prejudice. And this is what the American Psychology Association said, and it really gutted me, because we find all this stuff funny and we think it's okay. But what we're doing is we're just continuing to make us less likely to ask each other for help or to look to each other as able to support us in our work. We're less likely to actually achieve that shared vision. And so we need to do a language audit and make sure that we're not, joking about something that has actually been catastrophic to cohesion in our workplaces.
I love that notion of language audit. Some things that we have not covered is why do you stay at work interviews, the social bravery from Amy Cudd is so much more. If people were to find more about you, Jennifer, and your wonderful book, how might they do so?
Jennifer-moss.com. There's really everything there. And I'm pretty active on LinkedIn too. So you can always find me there. But the website has lots of stuff, and a lot of the articles I've written and the research that, I've done, and a lot about the book. But yeah, it's definitely been a labor of love and a lot jammed into that book. But yeah, it's been an exciting time for sure in this launch.
My hearty congratulations on the launch of this book. Well done. And Jennifer, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, William. You're an incredible host.
Thanks so much for listening to the Workplace Podcast. I really appreciate you being part of the conversation. If you found value in today's episode and want to support what we're building here, you'll find a link to our Patreon in the description. As a workplace expert, I'm here to help you resolve your workplace dilemmas. If your organization could benefit from my expertise, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Take a different path to success in your career, leadership, team, and organization. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.